to find the words, not by hitting people over the head, but by connecting with what they know to be true in a way that's relatable. If you can get people to laugh, they'll listen to you. If you can get people to feel an emotion, they'll listen to you. And that usually comes from story and less from lecturing, I have found.
Yeah.
Even as a parent, it's the same thing. It's as a parent.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Story is a way of organizing the invisible life. The invisible life is invisible, but if you give it characters, you start to say, oh yeah, this story makes sense. That story doesn't make sense. This story is true. That story isn't true. And I think that that's just an important thing that we all have to do in order to understand our own lives.
Hi, welcome to Wild and Beautiful. We're Joanna Hyatt and Lauren Enriquez, your co-hosts who every week are helping you live out your faith in a way that's biblically rooted, but culturally relevant.
Oh my goodness, friends, you are in for a treat this week, mainly because I just get to hang out and talk with a friend, but it's a friend you probably know, which doesn't always happen. So joining me this week is Drew Klavan, author, podcaster, there's a screenwriter, just really dear friend for our family. So that's really all that matters. Welcome to Wild and Beautiful.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Joe. How you doing?
Good. There's a long list of things we could say to recommend you, but I think people are probably familiar with your podcast over on the Daily Wire, and you've been writing 4 years, doing mysteries, New York Times bestsellers. Lauren is not on today, which is a real shame because she adores you. Would like to be adopted by you, adores you, has the paperwork drawn up, has informed me, in fact said, make sure he knows how much I love him. I said, in a non-creepy way? I'll do my best.
I accept creepy love. I'm all right with creepy love.
She figures since you're, a mystery writer that you can handle creepy and work with it. It'll be fine.
Exactly.
It'll be fine. So, but we're really excited to have you here. And the theme today, because this is, airing right before Christmas, is we're just helping everybody out with their Christmas lists because you have written some fantastic books.
I'm ready. I am ready to sell books for Christmas.
Good. Well, the first one we want to jump into is the one that came out, I think it was this spring, The Truth and Beauty. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see it here. And this one, I'll admit, when I first saw it, it said, it's looking at the work of England's greatest poets. And I thought, oh, that sounds so boring. But you did a fantastic job, friends. It's not boring. It is not boring. This is the beauty of having somebody who knows how to tell stories write nonfiction, because it felt like a great story. So what sort of prompted you to first do this? And then I want to dive into some pieces that stood out to me.
Well, I will tell you the absolute truth is that I had to write this book. I felt called to write this book. When the lockdowns happened, I thought I better seize this moment to do this because all my speeches and travel were canceled. And I thought I better do this now because it's a difficult book. I thought no one is going to want to read or buy or publish this book. And it was the wildest experience because while I was writing it, I felt like I was standing, those crime shows where they point rifles and there's a little laser dot on the guy. I felt I was standing on the laser dot of where God wanted me to be. I couldn't, my prayer life went silent because there was nothing else I had to say. I just thought, write the book. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And it was bliss. I was in absolute bliss. All the while knowing that no one would publish this book, no one would buy it, no one would read it, and I was going to have to publish it myself, but it had to be done. And so I wrote this crazy book, which was about my own reflections that I'll tell you about in a second. But I sent it when I finished it, I showed it to my wife first, as I show everything to my wife. And she literally said to me, I thought as I was reading this that you had gone insane. I said to her, no, it's a great book. I just have to cut out all the bad parts, and I cut out all the bad parts. I sent it to the one editor in America or anywhere that I thought might actually like it. And he instantly bought it and gave me to know he's a very polite, gentleman. And he gave me to know in his very polite, gentle way that we weren't expecting to sell any copies. We were going to bring this thing out, but he was supporting my writing. He was supporting me and he was in favor of this. We brought it out and it got on the USA Today bestseller list and and it's still selling. And it's just the entire experience has just been, when you're standing on that little laser dot, just go with it. Just trust that experience because that's where you're supposed to be. So it's been a really remarkable writing experience, really the most remarkable writing experience of my life, I think. And the story is basically this. I was talking to my son. I was telling him about my confusion of certain Bible passages, which turned out to be like almost all of the Gospels, and saying, some of this stuff just doesn't actually make sense to me. If Peter is walking on water and he starts to fall through the water, and Jesus says to him, "O ye of little faith," what is Jesus talking? Like, I've never walked even like a little bit on water. It seems to me it takes a tremendous amount of it. And all these questions that I had, my son, who is a brilliant, doctor, he's a doctorate from Oxford, who went to Yale before that. He's a brilliant guy. He said, "I think the problem is that you're trying to understand a philosophy instead of trying to get to know a person." And the minute he said that, I thought, yeah, that's obviously the smartest thing anyone ever said to me, because, I know my wife very, very well, but if you ask me what her philosophy of life is, I'm not sure I would know. But if you ask me, would she like this movie, or would she like this person, or how would she react to this, I would know. I would be able to answer that question. So I set out to reread the Gospels to understand Jesus, just as the main character of the Gospels. I even taught myself Greek, although badly.
I mean, that's pretty good still.
Yeah, I was dedicated. I was very dedicated. And I thought, no theology. I'm not going to listen to St. Paul. I'm not going to listen to anybody. I'm just going to listen to Jesus and get to know him. Just the way if you were reading a novel, you might get to know the main character, or you're reading a biography, you might get to know the subject of the biography. And as I was doing this, the words that kept coming back to me to explain what he was saying were the words of the Romantic poets, Keats and Wordsworth and Coleridge, and to some degree, Mary Shelley, who was not a poet, but was a Romantic writer, the woman who wrote, a young girl, really, who wrote Frankenstein. And I thought, this is actually not as weird an idea as it sounds like, because these guys were writing at a time just like our time, when faith was collapsing, when the entire world was changing, gender roles were being questioned, everything was being questioned. It was the revolutionary French Revolution time, and these guys were radicals. So a lot of them started out as radicals, some of them became conservatives, and they were trying to reconstruct the basis of European culture, which was Christianity. And they were doing it without knowing it. They didn't know what they were doing. They just knew that the bottom had fallen out and they had to start again. And so what they were doing was recreating Christianity without talking about Christianity, with one exception, which was Coleridge, who was not only the most brilliant of them, but one of the most brilliant men who ever lived. And he remained a believer for his whole life and inspired the rest of them. So it wasn't really as crazy as it sounded. I just knew that trying to explain it to anybody was going to be the job of a lifetime. And it really was I tried to say it, as you said, I tried to do it in terms of the stories of these men and who they were and the struggles that they faced, which are incredible, because on this little island of England, of Great Britain, every great poet, the greatest poets of the age, were all living. Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron and Blake, they were all alive at the same time, all of them interacting with each other and interacting with the poetry and interacting with the poetry of the past, which is part of the story too. And so it was really a very dynamic and beautiful story. And the poetry is as beautiful as anything, although I didn't write the book for people who read poetry. I wrote it for people who don't read poetry. That was me. My guy.
I am people who don't read poetry, because I read it and I went, wow, I need to go find these poets. You hear these names, but we've lost this practice of incorporating poetry into regular literature that we are reading as we grow up. And so poetry can seem a little daunting. And the way you did it, it connected it to what is going on. In the intro, you sort of lay out that the fight is really between belief and unbelief in their time. But I thought, wow, that is so true for our time. And there was a lot in this book that really did feel like we're living this again. And yet I didn't feel hopeless by the end. I felt hopeful, because I thought, well, they navigated this, and so could we, if we could just have a few great writers come out of this.
Well, it really is true that it ended, the Romantic age ended with the Victorian age, which I think is one of the high points of human culture and human history, a time of great conservatism in the social world, but also of reform, of giving the votes to more people, of understanding that we're going to have to live with Catholics and Protestants in the world and not kill each other, and a time when England extended its reach, over the much, attacked British Empire, which in fact civilized the world. And so I'm actually quite hopeful about the present age, which is similarly an age of revolution, an age when certain bad ideas have caught up with us yet again, but an age when people are thinking in new ways, and when belief is, I think, inescapable. I think everything that's going wrong in our culture has to do with non-belief and with materialism, not in the sense of greed, but in the sense of thinking of ourselves as meat puppets with chemistry sets inside, instead of as spirits, having a human experience.
How do you think, though, we connect with people who are on the side of unbelief? Because there seemed to be a time where, we may disagree on how we should go about an idea, but we had this sort of baseline commonality, whether it was because we had grown up in Christian homes, we understood sort of what natural law was, things that were instinctively right or wrong. I know, and the transgenderism thing is one that just kind of came out of nowhere. And you think 25 years ago, nobody would have been saying, oh yeah, this makes total sense. This is great. And so how do we even begin a conversation with people who don't even have that foundation from which we can work together?
That is the great question.
Oh, good. I'm so glad I could ask that.
No, and it's the question that these poets were dealing with. They couldn't go back to Christianity and say this is true because people had lost their faith. They had to go back and say, oh, here's a reason to believe in the soul. Here's a reason to believe that we are not just material. Here's a way of looking at life. And people would read the poetry of Wordsworth, who didn't become a Christian until much later in his life. They would read the poetry of Wordsworth, and suddenly they weren't depressed anymore, and they didn't know why. They had gone into this tunnel of materialism, this tunnel of rationality, rationalism, scientism, where these things were going to solve all the problems, and they had become depressed. And suddenly they read Wordsworth and they weren't depressed anymore. And what I feel is this. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and tomorrow, but we're not the same. Our language changes, our technology changes, our experience of the world changes because we've gone through all these radical things. And we have to find new ways to talk about the old truths. People keep saying to me that I should stop talking about God and stop trying to convince people through God. But the fact is, when we talk to people morally, we are assuming God. We are depending on their heritage of Christian faith to guide them. When we say, when we say, for instance, somebody is in favor of abortion and we hold up a picture and say, that's a baby in the womb. And they go, oh my God, I didn't realize that that's what a baby looks like at 12 weeks, at 18 weeks.
Right.
We're depending on something within them that is God-given and also God-based. And so it's not a bad thing to work your way back to God. I mean, you can't start by pounding the Bible because people don't believe in the Bible.
Right.
They don't care what's in the Bible. But you can start by saying, are you happy? One of the things that when I was still giving a lot of speeches, I would get up sometimes and just say, I'm an old guy, but it looks to me like young women are miserable. Mm-hmm. When I'm finished with the speech, stand up and tell me you're not. And I want to hear it. Nobody ever, not once, did any woman ever stand up and tell me she wasn't miserable. They all just confirmed what I said. You start from there, then you start asking, what path are you on that makes you miserable? You don't even have to get to God. You just have to remind them that they have an internal life, that their internal life is what their life is about. I mean, this is, when I talk about, for instance, pornography, I point out, that you're dealing with a woman when you're dealing with pornography who's a shape. She's a flat, two-dimensional shape. She has no inner life. And then you wonder why you're impotent when you turn to an actual woman who's a person who you actually like and don't want to do the things to her that you saw in pornography, don't want to treat her that way. You wonder why suddenly your body shuts down. Well, it's because you're not a shape, I mean, neither of us, not men nor women, are shapes. These things have to be retaught. We are so far down this path that people literally think they can cut pieces off their bodies and change their sexes. They literally can be convinced of this nonsense. And unless they are reminded that they are something complete, that their body is like a word that expresses an idea, it's not that there's a little ghost, Casper the ghost inside their body, but their body is expressing something that is in another, is held in the mind of God. We really have to start at the beginning. And that's what these poets did. And that's why I go back to them. And that's why I think the book has touched people the way it did. When I thought I was going to be hand selling books out on the street that I'd self-published like they were going to be typed on computer paper, this is why I think the book reached people, because they thought, oh yeah, I forgot, I'm not just this shape walking around.
I like that your editor really set the expectations low.
He's a wonderful, wonderful human being. And he's just such a
that
gentleman.
way no one was disappointed. If we keep the bar at this is not selling and you're crazy, then anything above that is just a win, which this book is definitely a win. So friends, if you have not yet gotten a copy, be sure to check out The Truth and Beauty by Andrew Klavan. And, in there, and you kind of touched on it, and maybe you don't realize you actually are very affirming of women, which as a woman raising 4 daughters, maybe I'm just like keen to hear that. But I noticed in the book, you talk about where Mary Shelley is pointing out too that we're trying to take women out of the role of women. And yeah, maybe it's some great advance in science someday. We figure out how to raise children and grow them without needing a woman, or maybe it's the worst thing we could ever be doing. And you talk about how the first thing to go is women as women in trying to push unbelief and dismantle what's old. And we're seeing that now.
This is the chapter on Frankenstein, which is the chapter, in fact, that seems to have moved people most, is about this 18, 19-year-old girl who essentially is inventing science fiction. She's writing the book that becomes modern science fiction. There are books you can say before this that were kind of science fiction, but this is actually the first work of what we think of as science fiction. And she and everyone else always says that this is the story of a man who tries to seize power from God by making life. But that's just not true. It's just not the story of the book. All human beings can make life. They make life from things that are there. Only God can make life from nothing. That's very different. And that's not what Victor Frankenstein does. What he does is he seizes from women the power to make life. He makes a person who has no mother. And the entire story and all the symbolism of the story is built into this. And Mary is a woman who has run off with a guy who has left his wife, Percy Shelley. She idolizes him as she idolized her father. She never stops idolizing him even after he's dead. And yet he treats her very badly. I mean, he believes in free love. He and Byron are, basically living out this doctrine of free love. And she is kind of going along with it. But meanwhile, she's having babies who are dying. She's in grief and they don't care. They kind of say, why are you grieving? We want you here with us. Why are you off grieving these little babies? Her father yells at her for grieving a 2-year-old child. He says, the child is 2, so the whole world doesn't come to an end. And she writes this book in which women become obsolete. And that is the basis of science fiction. And I maintain and I sort of prove in the book that this is the basis of all science fiction. The target of science is women. How do you eliminate women? They are just a pain in the neck. You want to have sex with them, and then they have these children, and then you have to take care of these children. They have emotions about these children. And men have been trying to eliminate this factor from their life, which is in fact the source and fountainhead of our humanity. I mean, it's not just, and Wordsworth writes about this so beautifully. It's not that women produce life with their bodies alone. It's that they produce life in the interchange of mother and child. And science, not that I care that much because I knew Wordsworth was right when I read his words, but science has borne Wordsworth out, that it's in the interchange of mother and child that people individuate and become human beings. And you only have to talk to somebody who had a mother who loved them and talk to somebody who didn't to know the difference. You can see it almost instantaneously. And so what I maintain is basically this is the fork in the road ahead of us, not just behind us, is whether or not, we're going to have a human world or not. Because soon, no doubt, there'll be machines that produce children. Soon there'll be a synthetic womb that can produce a human being. And the question is, are we going to use it? Some people will, I think. And then there's going to be that rebel band of people who have kept humanity alive since literally the year dot, who say, no, this is the role, the activity between men and women is where we live. And this transgender movement is not just a movement of perversion, though it's also that. It is a movement to eliminate women. It is a movement to say women don't exist. And that's why my friend Matt Walsh's movie was so powerful, because he just said, just define the word woman and nobody can do it. This to me is so basic. It's so obvious. And it's such a problem with feminism. When I attack feminism, which I do all the time, people immediately say, oh, you don't think women should have rights. And I think that's nonsense. All people have equal human rights. That has nothing to do with anything. But feminism is basically the elevation of male values. It says to women, you are just a homemaker unless you have, career ambition, unless you're making money. Even the other day, I said to a friend of mine, mothers are doing the most important job in society, but men are in charge of who makes history. Men say, this is what history is. Men say, this is where the award should go. This is where the money should go. And so they direct it to the things that they do, naturally enough, because that's the way men are.
Yeah.
And even he said to me, yes, because women make the people who make history. And I said, no, because history is unimportant. History is only an ancillary fact of the production of humanity, which is the all important thing, the making of souls. And I don't mean to I don't want to sentimentalize motherhood. It's not like the Victorians kind of did that. They sort of sentimentalized, the angel in the house. I know what I lived with a mother, I mean, I'm married to a mother. I've seen the work that goes into it and what it is. And sometimes it's brain deadening. Sometimes it's drudgery. But at the same time, it's soul work. It's just the most important thing anybody does. And I mean, and without it, we won't be human beings. And I don't think we're going to like that. We think that's going to solve all our problems, but it's just the end of what we are.
Well, and what exposes that feminism, at least modern day feminism, is a joke, is that they are not stepping in to protect women. It's really about how do women become like men. That's what the move for feminism to me feels like. It's like, how can we strip you of all the things that make you uniquely feminine and a woman and your abilities? Okay, so if you cannot have children, that doesn't mean you're any less of a woman, but all the things that a woman is potentially capable of, let's strip that down and make you look just like a man and call it equality.
Well, that's, and this is what kills me about like movies now, where if you don't say a woman is strong, then you've insulted her. And all the women in movies have their hands on their hips and they look like super, and they have women beating people up and punching guys and the guy goes rolling out the door. You think like, this is garbage. This is like a lie to begin with, but it also has left out this major factor that's going on in the world of women not just giving birth, but producing human beings through the interaction of themselves with another person. And that's not a source of drama. That's not a source of interest to us. I don't know. It's a very sick and sad thing. And it is the dominant idea of our culture. And it all goes back to materialism. I mean, the story that we have from the Gospels is the story of God incarnating himself so that we can know him. And the first thing he does is he chooses a mother. And he doesn't have to do that, right? He could snap his fingers or whatever God uses for fingers. He could just say, I will now be a person. But he doesn't do that. He takes the path to humanity that we all have to take. And because of that, Mary becomes a holy figure in the lives of both Catholics and Protestants. I understand we have differences about it, but still, this becomes basically the model of humanity through the Gospels. It's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable corruption in the human heart that is playing itself out so graphically now, but began to play itself out then. And it's really interesting to see us have to come to it again, because all bad ideas, because of the corruption of the human heart, all bad ideas come back.
Yeah. When I listen to your podcast, I love that you will frequently take letters in the mailbag from moms.
Yeah.
And just the way you do affirm motherhood for somebody who is at home these days, a lot more than I maybe even thought I would be, it is encouraging, because culture does make motherhood sound like it's like the backup plan. If you can't cut it, it's something else. Like, oh, I'm so sorry, you can do a job, so you're a mom. It's like, oh no, that's actually not how this works. So to hear that affirmed repeatedly is encouraging. And I know that there's lots of moms that oftentimes feel unseen, even as we're simultaneously being told, no, but it's really important what you're doing. So it's great to see you consistently celebrating moms in all of our rawness and mess. And, that's what the questions are in the mailbag. A lot of times it's the things women are struggling with. I want to shift to your memoir. This is probably the oldest book on the list that we're talking about today. The Great Good Thing, How a Secular Jew Comes to Faith in Christ. And, you've mentioned before that, and in reading that book, you see that a lot of books really actually led you to Christianity. What were some of the key books that you would say, if you have a friend who's not a believer, if you have a friend who is secular, what are some books that got you pointed in the right direction that you could recommend?
It's really interesting. I lived in a house that was all boys, except for my mom. I had three brothers, but my life was like one long fist fight until I was about 17, and yet I felt a lack of male role models. I felt there was something missing in the values of my house that were making it difficult. And so what I turned to what is now called tough guy fiction. I read Ernest Hemingway. I read the detective stories of Raymond Chandler with Philip Marlowe, Dashiell Hammett, The Maltese Falcon. And I love these books, and I love the movies that they made out of them with Humphrey Bogart and guys like John Wayne and all this. But I noticed that in a lot of them, there was this theme of quest. And a lot of them, Raymond Chandler especially, who was my big writing hero, Philip Marlowe was the guy I wanted to be, essentially. I wanted to become Philip Marlowe, this honest man in a corrupt society. And he was based on the knights, on the idea that he was carrying within him the concept of knighthood. That's how the first Philip Marlowe begins, is with him thinking about being a knight in this corrupt world. And so I started to read the books about King Arthur, and it's really shocking how the Arthurian legends have led so many people that I've now met to conversion, to actually finding Christ through the stories of these knights in armor, doing good deeds for the Round Table and searching for the Holy Grail. But for me, a Jewish kid who didn't know anything about Christianity, I thought, gee, there's a lot of Christianity in these stories. Maybe I should find out about this, because by then I was 15. I wanted to be a writer. I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to know what writers knew, So I started to read the Gospels, beginning with the Gospel. I had to go out and buy a Bible with the Gospels in them because we didn't have one at home.
Right.
And I tell in my memoir, it's a hilarious but tragic story that I'm 15 years old. It's the 1960s. I'm sexually active. I mean, I could have been doing all kinds of things, could have been reading anything, but I'm reading the Gospels of Luke, and my father walked in on me and caught me reading the Gospels, and he was furious. I look back on it, and it's funny now, because he literally could have caught me with a girl. He could have caught me with any kind of pornography that I was also reading, but he caught me with the Gospels. He was absolutely furious because he looked upon this, as many Jews do, as the enemy. This is the threat, letting the enemy into the household. He screamed at me. He told me he would disown me if I ever even thought of converting. And I was trying to explain to him, no, I'm actually just reading this as research. And yet it was such a central idea to all the novels that I loved, that it began to haunt me. And that was the thing. And, there's a wonderful line in William Blake where he says the Bible is the great code of literature, that you can't understand the Bible, you can't understand literature without understanding the great code that deciphers it. And that is absolutely true. And so the more I became a writer, and even as I started to become successful as a writer, the more I kept returning to this story of Jesus and trying to explain it away, trying to explain it as a psychological event that sort of informs stories. I mean, I would read books in which the character would convert, and I would say, well, symbolic, that is not really saying that this Jesus stuff is true. And yet it became more and more central to my life. I had terrible troubles in my 20s as I struggled with the way I had been brought up and with my own, madness. And I went insane. I went nuts. And at that point, I thought, I can't accept God now, even though I now have reasoned myself to the place where I understand God. It would just be a crutch. I would just be trying to keep from being as miserable as I am, which shows you how stubborn. I'm a hard character. I mean, I think I look back and think, wow, that's pretty tough. It's like, you're drowning, but you're not going to take driftwood, because that would be a crutch.
Sign of weakness.
Yeah. But by the grace of God, and I do believe, Joe, this was a genuine miracle. I found a psychiatrist who healed me, and this doesn't happen. Most psychiatrists are useless, and he actually healed me. And I was at the end of 5 years of going to see him once a week. I was a happy, successful, well-functioning person. And at that point, when I was joyful, I began to think, well, wait a minute. All that stuff that I was thinking about God remains true, even now that I'm not miserable. And that was what led me to prayer, and prayer led me to Christ. And so, the things that you read, it's really in some ways what you're looking for. I mean, you can read almost anything. The book that I think I come back to again and again and again is Crime and Punishment, because when I was in college, that's when moral relativism, postmodernism, all the things that have led to transgenderism were first coming up through the ranks, first coming up through the academy. And when I read Crime and Punishment, I just remember thinking, oh, it's all untrue. And so that kind of turned the ship of my life in a different direction. And I remember at one point when my career was faltering, I asked a friend of mine, a real far left wing Yale PhD, to read something I'd written that I couldn't sell. And I said, why am I not selling my books when I know this book is good? And he said, because you're sailing in the exact opposite direction of your culture. And I thought, oh, okay. I'm for that,
But you've continued to sail in that direction. I think what's remarkable is that, you have this history in a home where the Gospels are the worst thing you could be reading, a secular Jew. You're a Hollywood writer. You're steeped in, this culture of intellectuals and academia. You have, a Oxford scholar for a son, Spencer Klavan, no relation. And yet you have become very outspoken with a very contagious faith in Jesus. Was there a point where you thought, okay, I'm going to lose everybody. I'm going to lose all the friends. I'm still going to go? Or was there a struggle to say, okay, like a crossroads? Do I pursue this knowing I'm going against the culture and it may cost everything around me? Or did it just sort of feel like that laser dot that you referenced at the beginning? You're like, but this is exactly where I'm supposed to be.
No. I became a theist and I was praying, and I prayed over the course of 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, prayer had so transformed my life for the better that I was living in Santa Barbara. I was a Hollywood screenwriter. I was driving a BMW convertible. I drove up into the hills, and I said to God, you've transformed my life. What am I supposed to do for you? And it wasn't a voice in my ear. I'm not like, I don't hear voices, but I did hear this very, very solid thought. You should be baptized. And I'm driving along and I said out loud, you got to be kidding me. That it would destroy my life. My father will stop talking to me. I'm working in Hollywood. I'm making a bundle in Hollywood. I'll lose all my jobs and all this stuff. And I spent 5 months wrestling with it, trying to get out of it, looking, as W.C. Fields once said, I'm looking for a loophole, and I couldn't. And ultimately, out of just pure authenticity, I had to be baptized. I went from making, and I don't know how much of this was politics and how much of it was religion, but I went from making 7 figures in Hollywood to making 0. I had to sell my house. But I never regretted. I don't think I lost a minute's sleep over it, although it was difficult. I know I have a lot of friends who paid the price to keep the money and keep the jobs. I look in their eyes. I never want to see that in my own. I never want to look in a mirror and see the look in their eyes in my eyes, And so I've had a jolly life, I've a joyous life, truly. I said to myself when I was baptized, if it turns out that this turns me into some flake-headed, happy talk, smiley face jackass, I'll stop. I'll walk away. But instead, it made me much more realistic. It made me understand the tragedy of life much more deeply, the corruption of the human heart and my own heart much more deeply. It has made me a much tougher, more realistic writer, the opposite of what I was afraid of. And yet at the same time, it has filled me with joy, by which I don't mean happiness. I mean just vitality in life, So yeah, there was a price, there was a price for it, but it just has never it's weird to say it, but it is absolutely true. I never woke up in the middle of the night and thought maybe I should, ditch this stuff and get my old screenwriting work back. And God has taken care of me. Listen, I'm not a suffering guy. I've made it through. We had somewhat light, tough times. We never starved. I'm not in jail like, Jimmy Lai out in Hong Kong, Catholic guy fighting his corner. It was an easy martyrdom, if you can even call it that. I mean, so, and the rewards have been insane. I mean, insanely joyful. I don't even know how to begin to, certainly don't know how to begin to be grateful for it, but I don't even know how to begin to describe it. So,
well, in these last few minutes, let's shift to look at your writing now, essentially after, last Christmas, you came out with When Christmas Comes, a Yuletide mystery. And then this Christmas, you have the follow-up to that, A Strange Habit of Mine. Now, you've said that this is the first time you ever did a series. Is that true? I'm not calling you a liar, but I just have been trying to go, you've never had a consistent character in all of your other crime, mystery, none of them were a repeat?
I've written trilogies.
Okay.
And I started out writing under a pseudonym when I was very young, writing what was going to be a series of mystery, but I just lost interest in it. I just thought, no, I don't really want to write series. I think of a story as an arc from a character in one place to where he lands because of the thing that he goes through. But this again, if this wasn't providential, I don't know what is. While I was writing The Truth and Beauty and Lockdown, my friend Otto Penzler, who is probably the greatest mystery editor on earth, called me up and he said, how would you feel about writing a Christmas mystery? And I have had this idea in my head for 30 years that I had never been able to solve. I had this plot, I had a last scene that I knew was a great Christmas mystery, and I'd never been able to solve it. And I said, let me, since you asked, let me go out and try and solve this thing. And walking through the empty streets of Hollywood, because everybody was locked down.
Right.
In 2 days, I came up with the story for when Christmas comes. And so after I finished The Truth and Beauty, I went right into writing that. Also a lovely experience. We're having a wonderful time. But in the middle of it, I thought this character is different than other characters because what really happens in this story is other people's story becomes the main story, not his. So he is so many faceted that he could go through many stories. And I thought, I've never done this before, and I love doing new things, so let me try and do it. And the new book, A Strange Habit of Mind, has been a USA Today bestseller as well. And it's been really exciting. So, it's interesting to write books in a woke world where most people in publishing, it's only because Otto protects me, most people in publishing have editors come in. They've done it to me. They come in and they say, you described this character as coffee colored, but slaves had to pick coffee. So you can't do that. And, my answer to that is unprintable. I wouldn't say my answer in front of a lady, but I'm not going to do that. And it's only because I'm protected, by Otto and his press that I get to do it. And I think it's resonating with people.
So Enriquez sent me a question. She said, after having read The Great Good Thing and the Cameron Winter books, so Cameron Winter is the main character in these Christmas mysteries, if you will. She wondered, is the childhood of Cameron Winter that you write about in When Christmas Comes at all inspired by your own?
Well, sure. It's funny.
Can we ask that?
You always use bits of yourself like yeast in every character that you create to bring them to life. And for some reason, all my life, people have looked at some horrible villain who's committing sex crimes and butchering children, whatever somebody's doing in one of my horrible, these horrible tension filled books of suspense. And they say, did you base him on you? And they do it all the time. I had a character who was actually the hero of a book, but who dabbled in sadomasochism in his youth, and it was the thing he was trying to escape. And I had to actually do research. I had to go online. And what do these people do to each other? But people, is that you? It's like, no, it's not. However, I did use liberally things I talk about openly in my memoir. That do come into Cameron Winter's life, a sort of sad little rich boy childhood that he goes through that, has echoes of mine. And it really does. He also is a lover of the Romantic poets and a teacher of the Romantic poets. So he has that. We have that in common. But he is also a deadly, human being. And I think I'm probably a lot less deadly than that. And he's not, it's funny. He's not my daydream. He's not like who I want to be in any way, shape, or form. But our lives do intersect. There's no question.
I like him because he is complex. You're like, he's not all like just perfect good, which to read The Truth and Beauty, you realize these poets were complex. They were not perfect. We talked about Mary Shelley's kind of backstory. You think, wow, they created these pieces of culture, essentially, that changed their time, but they came from such a messy place. And so I think that's, again, speaks to the truth of the power of the gospel, that it takes what is so often a mess and the mix of good and bad and can bring something good and transformative that we on our own can't do. We're not capable of that.
It's so deadening in much of modern Christianity and certainly in Christian fiction. It is so deadening. The happy endings and the decent people and the niceness and the sweetness and the lack of ego that people, show. It doesn't exist anywhere in real life. And, just remember that the rock of Christ's church is Peter, who betrayed him in his worst moments. I mean, when you read that passage and you actually read it and look at it, think like, wow, if I did this, that would be the rest of my life. I would sit around punching myself in the head for having done this. And yet this is the rock on which the church is founded and should be founded, because we're all betrayers and all, corrupt and all this stuff. And yet that is where the joy comes in. It's so weird. We spend so much of our life avoiding shame. How hard it is to say I was wrong, how hard it is to say I'm sorry, how hard it is to say, I'm how flawed we are. And yet when you do it and you know that God has already forgiven you and loves you for it, there's this tremendous relief of pressure. You don't have to play. You don't have to pretend anymore. Listen to the way people talk. If you listen to the way people talk, I would guess like 85% of what they say is communicating to you what a good person they are. So in other words, lying. 85% of what they're saying is untrue.
Remember that, friends, as you head into Christmas.
Right. So if you realize we're all on the naughty list, that it's very relaxing.
Well, and as you said, it added depth to your writing. Andrew, my Andrew, is a filmmaker, yes. And we talk often about how actually, having a Christian worldview gives you a deeper story, a more richer storytelling ability, because you are not, trying to just say all bad, because you know that there is hope and there's an answer to the brokenness in humanity, but neither are you oblivious to the brokenness. You understand why it's there. And sometimes when Christians try to just do the good stuff, the football, touchdown at the end, it doesn't connect because it's missing what we all know to be true, which is the brokenness in each of us.
Right. And people in so much pain. Everybody all the time is in so much pain, so much anxiety. We have so much worry. It's like all the stuff that haunts us. If you pick up a story or you turn on a TV show and it's all like, Christmas, it's all Hallmark and Christmassy, that has its place. I'm not knocking it. I think that, a little bit of mindless entertainment is not going to kill you. But when you really want a book at 3:00 in the morning, you do not want to reach out and find this deadening, smiley face happiness, because it's not going to get you through to morning, and it's like, that's not the kind of stuff I write. It's why I sometimes find, especially with conservatives who are, there's a lot of Philistinism in conservatism, a lot of people who think that, the next congressional race is so much more important than the next novel or movie. And when I say to people, you should really buy the works of people like me, and buy good art from people like me, because that's where the future is. The future actually is created by culture, not by politics. And so I just think it's so important that we tell the truth, and sometimes fiction is the only way that you can tell the truth.
Well, and you make that case well, when we were talking about the truth and beauty of just, if you realize that this shift happened because of poets essentially speaking back to what we know to be true in our hearts, but maybe we don't have words for, then what an opportunity we have right now in this time of upheaval to find the words, not by hitting people over the head, but by connecting with what they know to be true in a way that it's relatable. If you can get people to laugh, they'll listen to you. If you can get people to feel an emotion, they'll listen to you. And that usually comes from story and less from lecturing, I have found.
Yeah.
Even as a parent, like it's the same thing. It's as a parent.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Story is a way of organizing the invisible life. The invisible life is invisible, but if you give it characters, you start to say, oh yeah, this story makes sense. That story doesn't make sense. This story is true. That story isn't true. And I think that that's just an important thing that we all have to do in order to understand our own lives.
All right. Last question for you, because we're at the end. This podcast is about how do we live culturally relevant lives that are still biblically rooted. And I think you do this well because you are not afraid to be a vocal, outspoken Christian, but standing at that intersection of tackling culture. What would you say to somebody who's, they're in their late 20s or their mom kind of doing the stay-at-home thing? Like, how do we, when it can feel overwhelming, I will say, is just the bad news keeps piling on. How do we live wild and beautiful in a way that is sustainable?
I think the first thing, I think the first thing is to deal with first things. I think that the first thing you should do is ask yourself, what am I doing? What am I striving for? Why am I changing diapers? Why am I waking up in the middle of the night? What am I creating here? Because I think in some ways, the opposite of evil is not good. The opposite of evil is creation. And I think that what we're put on earth to, there's all this talk in the Gospels, unless you're a branch of this is the thing that haunts me every single day. Every single day, I think of the fact that unless you're a branch of the vine of God, you're not going to bear good fruit. Well, then you think about that, and the purpose that you have is to bear fruit, is to create something out of yourself, even if it's only yourself, even if it's only the person that God made you to be. The one thing every single human being on earth knows for 100% certainty is he is not the person he was meant to be. Every one of us knows this. And that is actually the meaning of your life. That is actually the direction, the North Star of your life. And if you start to think in those terms, instead of thinking, what am I doing right this minute? Where are my hands right this minute? You start to understand that the work of your hands is the expression of your soul. And then it starts to become more meaningful. If you are going to live a material life, you're going to be miserable. You're going to, you'll have your drugs, you'll have your drinks, you'll have the things that get you by. And in those moments, you'll have bliss. But if you're not going to live into the spirit of who you are meant to be, you're going to be miserable. There is great joy in understanding. I often say it's the difference between being lost in a storm and being in a storm, but seeing the North Star and thinking, okay, that's where I'm going. That is where you're heading. And so what I would just say is begin with the first things. What am I doing here? What is the purpose of what I'm doing here? And if you think that that's going to be told to you by a guy who never did anything, and never invented anything, but has something to say about everything, it's probably not. It's probably going to come from the wisdom of the ages that has given you everything you have. And so go back, find out what people were saying, find out the things that they talked about, the ideas that they had, the things they died for, and decide what you would live for and what you would die for. And I think if you start with those first things, life becomes much easier. It sounds hard, but it's actually much easier.
Less Twitter, more Tolkien.
Just a little bit.
Thank you, Drew, for joining us. Everyone, the books we talked about will be in the show notes. Please pick up 1, 2, 3 of them, add them to your Christmas list. Be sure to share this podcast. Be sure to rate it and pass it along to people who need some ideas for Christmas books, some encouragement in living in this culture in a way that is wild and beautiful.